How you doing, YouTube? This is William Taylor here in the YouTube channel, The Eternal Gospel. Um, in the following video, it's a bit crude. I intend to show a diagram to better illustrate my hypothesis. Um, so I hope that you can bear with it because it's very crude and unprofessional. But once I have the time and get back to Florida, I do intend in making more professional videos with better graphics um, to help people digest the information better. Hope you enjoy the following video. How's it going, YouTube? I'm gonna try to make a diagram. Again, these are crude videos that I'm doing. I'm still running through some issues. I'm all the way up here in Point of Rocks, Wyoming. I do have a freight transportation company, um, and so it's been quite difficult for me to get back home in Florida. I'm about 3,000 miles away from home, but I don't wanna I really don't want to leave people waiting too long as well. So again, I'm gonna do this crude diagram to sort of explain what I was saying in the previous video. If you haven't watched that video, go watch it. I only have, this is going to be my second video, so it's not going to be too difficult for you to find. Okay, so when you look at when Paul converted, right, is generally believed is around 333 AD. And then using the letter to the Galatians, it says that he went to Arabia. I've already said that the word Arabia in Greek is Arabian, and Arabian could mean the country of Arabia, which was literally adjacent to Damascus. I mean, what does it mean to go to Arabia? Does it mean that he walked a couple of miles and was into the wilderness of Arabia and then came back? So this is a map showing the section of Arabia, which was known as the Nabatean Kingdom. So when people hear that he went to Arabia, a lot of people think that he went here, or that he went all the way down there where Aqaba is. But when you look at Damascus and where Arabia begins, seriously, it's probably 20 miles. And I I know as a fact that you can walk from Damascus into the edge of what used to be the ancient Arabia or the Nabatean Kingdom. 20 miles can be done in about 10 or 11 hours. So people think that when Paul went to Arabia, the reason they think there is a contradiction in Acts in contrast to Galatians is it has to do with the fact that people assume that he was many months in Arabia, when in fact he could have converted, recovered from the fact that his eyesight was restored, and after he gained strength, right? Acts says that he started preaching. Now you got to bear in mind that even if he, let's say, he woke up, gained his strength, walked to Arabia, and then was out there for a week or something like that, praying and fasting, we're talking about Paul would have been back in Damascus in less than 2 or 3 days. So Galatians is not contradicting Acts. It's just simply a matter of people not being able to understand exactly what he means. And I think because it's such a minute detail, and given the distance that Damascus is to ancient Arabia in Paul's time, then then it's not unlikely that Luke would have found that detail so trivial that it wasn't even worth adding into the narrative of Acts. The point is that when you look at what Acts expresses and then what Galatians is talking about, superficially it may seem like there's a contradiction, but indeed there's not. But focusing on the letter to the Galatians, right? He says that he converted, and then he went to Arabia. He went to Arabia, or Arabian, which the word can also mean Araba or Arabian, which could denote a cut in a mountain or basically a cave or something like that. So we don't necessarily know what exactly Paul meant, but even if he went to the country of Arabia, it doesn't mean it's modern day Arabia where he went into the peninsula, because we know, as a matter of fact, that Arabia, the country of Arabia, a portion of it is part of what is known as modern day Syria. Anyhow, after he went to Arabia, he immediately goes back to Damascus, and then he spent 3 years. Right? So after those 3 years, being in Damascus for some time, after 3 years, he went down to Jerusalem. So that's the early stages of Paul's conversion. So we can say that he converted around 33 AD, and around 36 AD, he was in Jerusalem. Now, coincidentally, around this time, around 37 AD, Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas were losing their offices, because what happened is, coincidentally, around this time in which Paul is persecuting the church, around 33 AD, historically speaking, and this is using Josephus, the reason why the governor of Syria, which he also had control of Damascus, based on Josephus, this governor got rid of Pontius Pilate because of some abuses that this man was doing. But we can inferentially deduce that Caiaphas was working in direct cahoots with Pontius Pilate, and there was some sort of persecution based on Josephus, and some issue. The Samaritans brought a complaint to the governor of Syria. But what I find coincidental is that 3 years before that, or around that time before Paul went to Jerusalem, he was persecuting the church, and he was on his way to Damascus. But they were also persecuting people in Samaria. This is corroborated in Josephus, which, as we all know, a lot of people don't believe that Acts is historical, but Acts sort of points at the same issues. That there was a big persecution happening, and Caiaphas was behind it. It does not mention Pontius Pilate in the book of Acts. However, when Paul says that he had letters from the high priest, that could only been Caiaphas. So this is not really the undesigned coincidence, which, when I say undesigned coincidence, I'm not using the term in the same manner that Lydia McGrew is using the term undesigned coincidence, because for the most part, Lydia McGrew depends a lot, a lot from the text of the New Testament, and I'm not saying that what she's doing is wrong, but I can understand why experts will see that as problematic because you're staying within the text. However, the undesigned coincidence that I'm referring to is that you have a story in Galatians which, if you can get past the whole Arabian um, narrative, because Paul never denies being in Damascus, right? But then in Galatians, he never says how long he was in Arabian or in Arabia. But when we look in Acts, it seems the author of Luke of the book of Acts, sorry, the author of the book of Acts omitted this small detail because maybe it wasn't a long period of time, but it does agree on the fact that Paul was in Damascus and then he went to meet the disciples, and the disciples could mean that he met a couple of them, and that would be representative of the apostles. Not, it doesn't say I met all the 12 apostles, but he says, it is said in the book of Acts that he met the apostles. That could be one, that could be three, that could be 12, who knows. The point is that when you really look at Galatians and the book of Acts, there really is not a contradiction. It's just that there's most likely omission of minor details that were not going to contribute to the overall narrative. But this is not the important part. It's that in Galatians he says that after these 3 years have transpired, then 14 years went by, right? And after those 14 years, that's when he went back to Jerusalem. Why is that important? Is because that will place that event based on Galatians around the year 50 AD. And around the year 50 AD, based on the book of Acts, it's when Paul met Luke, okay? Because in chapter 16, Acts chapter, oh shit, this is so difficult because I gotta hold the phone on one hand. Chapter 16 and onwards, that's when the we document begins. And it seems like whoever that we is, who's interjecting into the story in the narrative of Paul, for now, let's just call that we as being Luke. Just so for the simplicity of the argument, because I know that most people who might be watching this video might not believe that the we is actually referring to Luke himself. But again, for the simplicity of the argument, let's just stick with Luke, right? So Luke interjects himself. It becomes the we document, chapter 16 and onwards, and that happened in Philippi. Okay, so around the year 51 AD, what most people don't seem to realize is that the we document resumed. I mean, it stops being referring to himself as we, and that happens somewhere around chapter 18, clearly showing that Luke separated from Paul around the year 51. Okay? But then, and this is a small detail that I don't understand why a lot of people miss, which around the year 53, Paul is no longer with Luke. Around the year 51 all the way to 53, but around the year 53, Paul goes back to Jerusalem. Okay? And when he goes back to Jerusalem, let me rephrase that. He didn't go back to Jerusalem. He went back to Israel. And he was around Caesarea, and I believe he also went to Tyre and Sidon. but this is where the undesigned coincidence that I notice begins to take place. And it's very difficult for me to show it in this manner because obviously it's not a very professional video and it's not a very professional diagram. But we see that around the year 52 AD, that's when the procurator Felix came into power. Josephus tells us that Felix persecuted, Josephus doesn't give us an exact date as to when Felix persecuted the Egyptian false prophet. Shit. It's so hard to hold the paper and write. So, but what we can assume is that it cannot be earlier than 52 because Felix started governing in the year 52 and he was the one who killed some of the men of this Egyptian false prophet. So why is that important to know? It's because of what's going to come after. And this is where I found, man, my pen just broke. Jesus Christ. This is where I began to see that there was a undesigned coincidence of, I don't know, man, of astronomical proportions because of everything that transpires afterwards, which is not contained in the Bible, or in other words, in the book of Acts. But when you look at the gaps of the we document, so we are assuming that we is referring to Luke. Luke separates from Paul around the year 51 AD. They meet around the year 50. Paul goes to Israel in the year 53, but he's not with Luke. So the question is, where did Luke go? I mean, they separated in Philippi. They met in Philippi, but then they separated in Philippi. And then Luke resumes the whole we document after chapter 19. But chapter 19, it's already, it's generally believed that the events contained in Acts chapter 19 is AD 54. Okay? So, if my hypothesis says that 1 Thessalonians, right? I don't have a Bible here to be able to show you this. I do have Koine Greek Bibles at home. It will be a lot easier for me to show you. But for now, let's just use this as a tantalizing video for a future video where I can be able to denotate all these points in a better fashion. But for now, let's just use this as a crude video to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about. If Thessalonians was written in the year 49 AD, and Thessalonians, based on its keywords and keyword placement, what that means is, if let's say in chapter, again, I'm only going to use chapter 4 and 5 as an example, but that's not the only chapter. I just want that to be clear, because there's plenty of allusions that will demonstrate what I'm saying. When you look at the chapter, right, and it has all these sentences, right, within the sentences in the Koine Greek, in Thessalonians, you'll have, like one keyword here, then the sentence keeps flowing, and then you have another keyword here, and then the sentences keep flowing, within the same body of theme. Then you have another keyword here, but this is all contained within the same body of context, and then you have another keyword here. When you extract these keywords, because of their order in which they are denoted, I catalog every instance of those things happening, and then I look for where these themes might seem to be coming from, and where they best match based on their keyword flow order within the theme and their sentences. To my surprise, a lot of the themes contained in the book of Thessalonians, which was written in the year 49, seems to match the same flow of keyword order from where the theme seems to be alluded from. In this case, is Matthew chapter 24, towards the end of the verses, and then the entire chapter 25. When I extract the keywords in Matthew, right? And Matthew is generally accepted. Matthew is generally accepted to be written post 80 AD. Then what we have to then explain is why we have more than one instance of different themes within Thessalonians, that their keyword order of these themes seems to be coming from themes only found in the book of Matthew. Okay, so one person might say, well, somebody had the letter of the Thessalonians, and then they went and proceeded and wrote the book of Matthew using Thessalonians. Okay, this is a counter argument that I postulated to myself to see if I find holes in my hypothesis. And I immediately found problems with that hypothesis, simply because when you look at the instances in which this occurs, Thessalonians does not allude to any other gospel. And why is that important? Because if Paul, by the year he's writing, in the year 49, which is within the timeline of the 14 years before he goes back to Jerusalem, and the events of the Egyptian false prophet at the time that Thessalonians is being written, then the material contained in the book of Matthew, referring specifically to the flight to Egypt, at this time or any time prior, if indeed the gospel existed, then the fact that Jesus was in Egypt would have not been a problem, and there would have not been any negative association, because this man right here, whoever he is, was not a problem, because he must have come post 52 AD. So the fact that Thessalonians oftentimes has keyword flowing in the same manner, in the same order, and the themes that that Paul is alluding to are contained only in the book of Matthew, then we have to ask the question, could Matthew have used Thessalonians to write its gospel? Well, this is where the problem begins. Early church fathers states that Matthew was written first, then let's write a little M for Mark, and then Luke, and then last John. The problem that I immediately saw with this counter argument is that if anybody would have written using the letters of Paul to write a gospel, which is supposedly post 80 AD, then what you will expect to find is that not just keywords from Thessalonians and themes in Thessalonians will be in Matthew, but you'll find more themes and keyword and their order from multiple other letters. And you do not find that. Which means that if a forger used the letter of Thessalonians to create Matthew, he must already have been aware of the letter's chronology, and more importantly, the church father traditions. In order for him to use the letters in their chronological order, so that as he's creating each gospel to match this chronology established by the early church fathers, so that the letters will emulate this chronology. If a forger created Matthew using Thessalonians, and he was aware of the chronology of the letters, then he should have been ultra intelligent to know that he had to create the letters to emulate the chronology of the early church fathers. And by him doing that, he would have to have cataloged the keywords from each letter, from each consecutive letter, so that when he creates Matthew, and Matthew emulates Thessalonians, but it does not emulate, let's say, Corinthians, it's so that he could fool people in the future, so that people could find this pattern and say, well, the letter, it could be proof that Matthew was indeed already accessible to Paul by the year 49. Because what happens is that then in the year 55, right, AD 55, that's when First Corinthians, First Corinthians is written in the year 55. But now Corinthians alludes to Luke's gospel. Okay. So far so good, right? Why is this problematic? Because now you have keyword phrase, keyword placement order that seems to correlate with the Gospel of Matthew, placing it in at or before 49 AD. You have the events of 52 AD of the Egyptian false prophet. Oh man. And then you have AD 55 AD. First Thessalonians. First Thessalonians alludes to Matthew. First Corinthians alludes to Luke. So I said to myself, how likely is it that when Paul separated from Luke, or how unlikely is it that when he separated from Paul in 51 AD, that Luke might have traveled to Jerusalem? Right now I'm speculating, but I'm just going to postulate an inference. Paul and Luke are not together from 51 AD all the way to 55 AD. Because in 55 AD, it's when the we document resumes. So if the we document resumes in 55 AD, Paul and Luke rejoin at Philippi in 55 AD. The question is, where was Luke for nearly 4 years? Luke himself, in the book of Luke, he says that he went and investigated with those who were ministers of the word from the beginning. That still doesn't tell us nothing. However, we know that Luke does not contain the flight to Egypt, and Corinthians by AD 55 is already making allusions to Luke. AD 49, Thessalonians is making allusions to Matthew. So why would these two letters be floating around with allusions to each gospel centered around this event? Why? You have to realize that none of this information is put together in the Bible or in any external sources. We're using external sources and internal sources to see if we see a pattern. The pattern is this: Thessalonians, makes strong allusions to Matthew. Thessalonians is 49 AD. Corinthians makes strong allusions to Luke. Corinthians was written in 55 AD. So what happened between 55 AD and 49 AD for Paul's language suddenly reflect another gospel seemingly matching the early church fathers' chronology, that Matthew was first and Luke was written later? And then at the center of it all is the event of this Egyptian false prophet. Why? And this is where I'm going to make the argument of inference to the best explanation. Luke was already in circulation. Paul was preaching out of it, seemingly matching the church tradition that Matthew was written in the year 40, AD, after the first persecution in which Christians had to flee Jerusalem. Paul converts somewhere around 33 AD, around 40 AD. That's when Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas are no longer in power. But by now, based on early church tradition, Paul might have become aware of Thessalonians. Even if the book of Matthew, according to church tradition, was not written in the year 40, the fact that Thessalonians is making strong allusions to Matthew in 49 AD, it's already given us inferences that Matthew might have been already circulating before 49 AD. Suddenly, the language of Paul changes in Corinthians that reflects Luke, but Corinthians is 55 AD. And what do we see in the middle? Again, the Egyptian false prophet. Luke omits the flight to Egypt. But why would he do so? If he came after Matthew, why would he omit the flight to Egypt if that indeed happened? And using the argument of inference to the best explanation, this event is all the motivation this man over here would have needed to omit the birth narrative here, because here in 49 AD, because of Thessalonians, here the knowledge contained in Matthew would have not been a problem, because this man was not a problem. After this man became a problem, Luke came to the scene. He separated from Paul in 51 AD for 4 years, giving all this time before the letter of Corinthians was written for Paul to become aware of the Gospel of Luke, so that then he can allude to it in his letter, which is 55 AD. It gets more complex than that, because when I use applied statistics to all the occurrences of this principle of the keyword order within the sentences of a body of a theme found in Thessalonians, what I notice is that it doesn't happen only one time. It happens over, if I remember correctly, because I don't have the data here, I'm inside my truck. But when you look at the amount of times that happens, there's a principle in statistics that says when you have more than 3 or 4 occurrences of something happening, it no longer stays in the realm of coincidence. It passes into a pattern, and that's when you do a hypothesis testing to see if there's a correlation between the variables. In this case, the fact that Thessalonians seems to allude to Matthew, to see if there's indeed a correlation. It gets even more complex than that, because when we look into the writing style of Paul, I want you to understand this principle. I want you to understand it perfectly. Whenever Paul makes allusions, let's say, to the Old Testament, and he does not use the keyword phrase in the scriptures. In other words, he gives you a sentence of something, and then you read it and you think, oh, that must be Paul's own ideas or theology. However, unless you knew the theme and the concepts that he's putting forward, that it actually comes from the Old Testament, you will never know that he's indeed making allusions to the Old Testament. And normally, whenever he starts with something from the Old Testament, normally he starts with the first few sentences as pure as possible from where the allusion comes from. And what he normally does oftentimes is that the last two or three sentences, he stays with the same body of the concept and the theme, but the last two sentences, he kinda reverses it, or oftentimes he interjects his own ideas. Now, when I search all the times that Paul does this with the Old Testament, what it does is it gives me data points to do a statistical analysis, which helps validate that indeed this is the writing style of the person who will oftentimes allude to something. And we know that the Old Testament was written by that time and he had access to it. So if he's doing that with the Old Testament on multiple occasions, then whenever he alludes to the New Testament, where in these allusions the set order of keywords flow in the same manner, then it is not unlikely that indeed he had access to the written form of the Gospels. Because oftentimes, whenever he does allusions to the Old Testament, right, and let's say allusions to the Old Testament, you see the same pattern, that the keywords will always flow in the same manner. And that raises our confidence level that if he's doing this with the Old Testament, then it's not improbable and it's not unlikely that the man had the written form of Matthew, Greek Matthew, and he was actually alluding to it because of how many instances of this happens. The only problem is that whenever he alludes to concepts in the New Testament, he also does not say in the scriptures. Remember, there are many instances in which Paul says in the scriptures, but anytime an instance like that popped up, where he's clearly giving you a quotation of the Old Testament, I will ignore that and I will not put it as part of my data set. Why? Because he's already telling you, it's making it very obvious in the scriptures. So what I did rather was to focus on allusions that he's making of the Old Testament without the keyword phrase in the scriptures, and then I analyzed the body of the context and his writing style and his thought process. Because then, if we see that the same pattern is happening for things that are alluding to the New Testament, then it becomes less unlikely that he indeed had the Gospel of Matthew by the year 49 and the Gospel of Luke by the year 55, and Luke omitting the flight to Egypt. This event is all the motivation Luke needed to do that. How do we know what's the writing style of Luke? I'm going to give you various examples. In Matthew, we find that Peter sank in after he stepped out of the boat. And oftentimes in Matthew, he's portrayed as a weak person. Luke does not do that. Luke portrays Peter as a strong leader, as a leader who was feared in the beginning of the church, when some people lied to him about selling the lands and stuff like that, and then the entire congregation, or the ecclesia, the church in this case, were afraid because of what happened. And Luke presents Paul as a person who's not weak in faith. Also, when Peter, he presented Peter as a person who's strong in the faith, who's a strong leader, somebody who's to be feared. And then when Jesus says in Matthew, "Get behind me, Satan," guess who omits that? Luke does. So that's a brief example. I have many other examples where Luke is more of a public relationist than anything. He likes his characters to always be in a good light, especially in the Gospels, because he's going to do further development in later Gospels. In the book of Acts, sorry. So because he's mindful that he needs to portray his main characters as strong, in this case Peter, why will it be implausible he's doing the same thing with Jesus by omitting the flight to Egypt because of the negative connotations of the Egyptian false prophet, which happened in the year 52? And I repeat again, coincidentally, that's when Paul and Luke separated. 4 or 5 years later is when we see that Corinthians is alluding to Luke, and is post the event, and is omitting Matthew. And Corinthians strongly alludes to Luke. Do you see that there is a pattern? I'm not fully elaborating because I don't have the proper tools, but I do intend to do this. It's only fair. What I intend to do when I get home is, once I have my computer, we're gonna dissect the Koine Greek, and then I'm gonna have the immediate translation next to it. I know how to read and write Koine Greek, but I'm gonna have the translation next to it within the screen, to help people see what I'm trying to illustrate. And then we're gonna go through this concept over here that I mentioned, where Paul, whenever first of all, before I get into the keyword placement in order, what we're going to do is, first we're going to establish a baseline as to how Paul quotes the Old Testament without referencing that is coming from the Old Testament. And we are going to use examples, multiple examples, more than 10, so that whoever is going to be watching these videos, they're gonna see that indeed this is the writing style of the man. And if we know that the scriptures were already accessible to him, then when we see the same pattern happening, but to allusions and themes that are contained in the New Testament, and when we compare the Koine Greek and the keyword and their placement, and then we match them to portions of the Gospels, then this should raise our confidence level that he's indeed quoting or paraphrasing the scriptures as he had them, and is indirect proof that by the year 49 he would have already had access to Matthew. But because of the incident of the Egyptian false prophet, and then fortunately enough we have Corinthians, and Corinthians strongly alludes to Matthew, it happens to be post 55, after the event of the Egyptian false prophet, which all of this diagram seems to show that there might be a pattern here, that it's not relying entirely from within the Bible. We can use external history, and then through the argument of inference we can conclude, although it's not 100% proven, but I think that, to me, this is indeed proof that maybe the early church fathers were not that incorrect after all. Okay, in the bottom of this video, I'm gonna leave a link. It's called Farmer's Argument for Matthean Priority, which goes into trying to explain why most, or some experts, not most, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Some experts believe that Mark is actually post Matthew and Luke. Early church fathers established that the Gospels with genealogies were written first, and those without genealogies were written after. And there seems to be a lot of evidence to point that Matthew might have been first, Luke was written after, and Mark seems to be conflating a lot of the concepts found in both Matthew and Luke. And I'm going to leave the link to the article from that scholar in the description section for your further reading. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this. Again, I do apologize. I only God knows, I've been trying to get back to Florida. Like I said, I'm stuck here waiting for the repairs of my truck. But I do promise you that once I get to Florida, we're going to dissect the Koine Greek. We're going to look at the keyword placement, and the fact that this pattern, which is super complex, seems to be validating the early church fathers of the chronology as to when the Gospels were written. Again, a forger would have to have had all this understanding of all this chronology, even though it's not spelled out anywhere in the New Testament. And he would have to have understanding of the chronology of each letter, so that as he's creating a false gospel, he will have to be extremely careful and detail oriented to take keywords only contained in the letter of Thessalonians and their keyword order placement, in order for this to sort of emulate the this chronology, which is not spelled out anywhere, but this chronology seems to be validating the early church fathers chronology, that Matthew was first and then Luke. I don't know if you can see what I'm saying, but then when we go further into the Koine Greek, I'm also going to be implementing correlation coefficient, and also I'm going to be performing a chi-square analysis of this pattern to see if I don't know if indeed there is a pattern, and I will leave you, the viewer, to decide. Thank you and have a great day. I also want to finish this video by saying that whether Mark is first or in between Matthew and Luke or post Matthew and Luke, it still has no bearing into this hypothesis that I'm presenting, simply because the pattern just simply points at, in the case of Thessalonians, the pattern seems to point at traditions only found in Matthew. And likewise, Corinthians, and because of the keyword placement and order, seems to only be matching traditions only found in Luke. So I just wanted to end the video by saying that. And again, this is not a point of discussion where I'm trying to establish this as completely factual. I'm just simply noting that there is indeed a pattern. I guess if this pattern and hypothesis is going to be taken seriously in the scholarly world, I guess it will have to pass the scrutiny of peer review, because in most cases, the dating of the Gospels does not rely a lot on external evidence. It must, most oftentimes it does rely, like the scholars rely on linguistics and cultural back settings and all of that. And I just don't want you to think that I'm not aware of all these arguments. In fact, most people who argue against Matthean priority, who are in favor of a post 70 AD, I mean, most people are not scholars, but they don't even dissect the data as to why the scholars arrive at this conclusion. I've looked at the data from all these scholars, and I understand the arguments, but I just don't find them convincing enough, man. And if I was to go through every single point as to why the scholars date Matthew and Luke and the Gospels post 70, I mean, if I was to go line by line through the Gospels and the linguistics and the Koine Greek, oh my God, what you're gonna immediately find is that the argument does not hold water, man. Because a lot of the concepts, a lot of the linguistics, we have plenty of archaeological evidence from other documents that are a little older than, that are older than 30 CE. And they contain the same linguistic and the same basic structures and tenets. So I think that at the end of the day, the only argument that they actually will have in favor after me analyzing the data for the argument that they're postulating, is that the fact that Matthew 24 speaks of the destruction of the temple. That is really the only argument they actually have in favor. But when we look at all the other arguments and you analyze them, paired with this new data that I'm bringing forward, because to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody has ever analyzed the Koine Greek of these letters and found this pattern that I found. So, to my knowledge, I may be the first person in the world who has discovered this. And because I don't like to be a scholar's dummy and having them as my ventriloquist, I'm just simply not going to be repeating information. I'm a critical minded individual. I want to analyze the argument. I'm also going to analyze the counter arguments. And then I'm going to weigh in that information paired with the ability that I have to perform research. So, in my educated research, and after analyzing every angle, I have to conclude, in my strong personal opinion, Matthew is not post 70 AD. I hope you find this video enjoyable. Again, once I have the time, I promise I'm going to make a very professional video with detailing every single point that I'm going to be bringing forth. And I'm still debating if I'm in the video that I'm going to be putting forth, if I want to bring the arguments that the scholars bring for a post 70 AD, because I'm just afraid that then the video might become too extensive, and then it's gonna lose the interest of most viewers. Or maybe I will just do a second video after I come up with the video explaining the post 70 AD position, and then we can bring it all together at the end of the video with a conclusion section where we synthesize all the information and then leave it up to the viewer to conclude what is it that they think is most likely true. All right, well, thank you. I do appreciate you watching this, and hopefully in the future I'm going to be coming with better content that is more professional and better digestible. Thank you and have a great day.